Paris. His assignment was to help promote French-American relations through the visual arts. Paul had lived and worked in France in the 1920s, spoke the language beautifully, and adored French food and wine. Paris was his favorite city in the world, so when the U.S. government offered him a job there, he jumped at the chance. I just tagged along as his extra baggage. We had met in Ceylon in the summer of 1944, when we'd both been posted there by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA. Paul was an artist, and he'd been recruited to create war rooms where General Mountbatten could review intelligence. I was head of the registry, where, among other things, I processed agents' reports from the field and other top-secret papers. Late in the war, Paul and I were transferred to Kunming, China. But now the war was over. We had been married in 1946, lived for 2 years in Washington, D.C., and were moving to Paris. We'd been so busy since our wedding day, September 1st, 1946, that we'd never taken a proper honeymoon. Perhaps a few years in Paris would make up for that sorry state of affairs and give us a sort of working honeymoon. As I gazed through the porthole, I realized I had no idea what I was looking at. France was a land I had long imagined, but had no real sense of. In Pasadena, California, where I was raised, France did not have a good reputation. My tall and taciturn father, Big John McWilliams, liked to say that all Europeans, especially the French, were dark and dirty, although he'd never actually been to Europe and didn't know any Frenchmen. I had met some French people, but they were a couple of cranky spinster school teachers. Despite years of learning French by rote, I could neither speak nor understand a word of the language. I was a 6'2", 36-year-old, rather loud and unserious California. The sight of France in my porthole was like a giant question mark. By 7 a.m., Paul and I were ashore, and our bags had passed through customs. A crane pulled our large, sky-blue Buick station wagon, which we'd nicknamed the Blue Flash, out of the ship's hold. Paul finished stowing our luggage away. We wedged ourselves into the front seat and pointed our wide, rumbling nose southeast, toward Paris. 2. Saulmeunier. The Norman countryside struck me as quintessentially French, in an indefinable way. Each little town had a distinct character, though some of them, like Yvetot, were still scarred by gaping bomb holes and knots of barbed wire. We saw hardly any other cars, but there were hundreds of bicyclists, old men driving horses and buggies, ladies dressed in black, and little boys in wooden shoes. The fields were intensely cultivated, and the occasional pink and white stucco villa, set at the end of a formal alley of trees, was both silly and charming. Quite unexpectedly, something about the earthy, smoky smells, the curve of the landscape, and the bright greenness of the cabbage fields reminded us both of China. Oh, la belle France! Without knowing it, I was already falling in love. At 12:30, we flashed into Rouen. There the guide Michelin directed us to Restaurant La Couronne, the Crown, which had been built in 1345 in a medieval house. Paul strode ahead, full of anticipation, but I hung back, concerned that I didn't look chic enough, and that the waiters would look down their long Gallic noses at us Yankee tourists. It was warm inside, and the dining room was comfortably old-fashioned. We were greeted by the maître d'hôtel. Paul spoke to him, and the maître d' smiled and said something back in a familiar way, as if they were old friends. Then he led us to a nice table. The other customers were all French, and I noticed that they were treated with exactly the same courtesy as we were. Nobody rolled their eyes at us or stuck their nose in the air. Actually, the staff seemed happy to see us. As we sat down, I heard 2 businessmen in gray suits at the next table asking questions of their waiter, who gesticulated with a menu and answered them at length. "What are they talking about?" I whispered to Paul. "The waiter is telling them about the chicken they ordered," he whispered back. "How it was raised, how it will be cooked, what side dishes they can have with it, and which wines would go with it best." "Wine?" I said. "At lunch?" I had never drunk much wine other than some $1.19 California Burgundy, and certainly not in the middle of the day. In France, Paul explained, good cooking was regarded as a combination of national sport and high art, and wine was always served with lunch and dinner. "The trick is moderation," he said. Suddenly the dining room filled with wonderfully intermixing aromas that I sort of recognized but couldn't name. The first smell was something oniony. Shallots, Paul identified it, being sautéed in fresh butter. "What's a shallot?" I asked sheepishly. "You'll see," he said. Then came a warm and winey fragrance from the kitchen, which was probably a delicious sauce being reduced on the stove. My stomach gurgled with hunger. I couldn't help noticing that the waiters carried themselves with a quiet joy, as if their entire mission in life was to make their customers feel comfortable and well-tended. We began our lunch with a half-dozen oysters on the half-shell. I was used to bland oysters from Washington and Massachusetts, which I had never cared much for. But this platter of Portuguese had a sensational briny flavor and a smooth texture that was entirely new and surprising. Rouen is famous for its duck dishes, but after consulting our waiter, Paul had decided to order sole meunière. It arrived whole, a large flat Dover sole that was perfectly browned in a sputtering butter sauce with a sprinkling of chopped parsley on top. The waiter carefully placed the platter in front of us, stepped back, and said, "Bon appétit." I closed my eyes and inhaled the rising perfume. Then I lifted a forkful of fish to my mouth, took a bite, and chewed slowly. The flesh of the sole was delicate, with a light but distinct taste of the ocean that blended marvelously with the browned butter. I chewed slowly and swallowed. It was a morsel of perfection. In Pasadena, we used to have broiled mackerel, boiled poached salmon, and the occasional pan-fried trout when camping. But at La Couronne, I experienced fish, and a dining experience of a higher order than any I'd ever had before. Along with our meal, we happily downed a whole bottle of Puy Fumé, a wonderfully crisp white wine from the Loire Valley, another revelation. Then came salade verte, laced with a lightly acidic vinaigrette, and I tasted my first real baguette, a crisp brown crust, giving way to a slightly chewy, rather loosely textured pale yellow interior, with a faint reminder of wheat and yeast in the odor and taste. Yum! We followed our meal with a leisurely dessert of fromage blanc, and ended with a strong, dark café filtre. Paul paid the bill and chatted with the maître d', telling him how much he looked forward to going back to Paris for the first time in 18 years. The maître d' smiled as he scribbled something on the back of the card. "Tiens," he said, handing it to me. The Durand family, who owned La Couronne, also owned a restaurant in Paris called La Truite, he explained, while Paul translated. On the card he had scribbled a note of introduction for us. "Merci, monsieur," I said, with a flash of courage and an accent that sounded bad even to my own ear. The waiter nodded as if it were nothing. Paul and I floated out the door into the brilliant sunshine and cool air. Our first lunch together in France had been absolute perfection. It was the most exciting meal of my life. Back in the flash, we continued on. As dusk came, the unmistakable silhouette of the Eiffel Tower loomed into sight. Paris. At nightfall, we entered the city via the Porte de Saint-Cloud and arrived at 7 Rue